The key word in Psalm 40 is obedience. This is David's response to the challenges that he's been through. We might even look back to Psalms 38 and 39, these very dark and difficult, painful psalms, and begin to see in Psalm 40, if this is ordered chronologically, that this could be David's response to the dire situation that he was in those previous two psalms. We don't know exactly the occasion, but David is celebratory in this psalm, at least initially, because he has been delivered from a very difficult situation. By genre, this psalm has elements of trust and confidence and thanksgiving, but there's also some implicit lament and struggle within this psalm as well. It's got a little bit of everything, and it's one of the favorites, I'll have to say, of mine and of many people, because it's so real and raw with this great mixture of emotions. It begins with expressions of confidence. David says, I waited patiently for Yahweh. He inclined and he heard my cry. It seems to be a response to the Psalm 39, where David is crying for God's help and relief. So this psalm has a much more optimistic, grateful tone as he describes God lifting him up from the pit of destruction, out of the miry bog, from the quicksand that he was stuck in. He's set his feet upon a rock. His steps are now secure. It's echoes of Psalm 16, where David described God lifting him up, drawing him out of many waters. In verse 3, he put a new song in my mouth, a song of praise to our God. Maybe even this song that he is writing here. It's throughout the Psalms, there are these references to new songs, and it suggests to us that we will always be writing new songs because God will always be rescuing and acting on our behalf, and so there'll always be a reason to express that in new ways. And because of this, he says, many will see and fear and put their trust in the Lord. David is hoping that his testimony will be an influence for others, that he'll have a story that will be an encouragement to others as well. It reminds us that when God blesses us, that we need to be sure to share that with others. And that leads David to just simply express this bit of wisdom. I've colored it yellow to express the fact that wisdom is golden, and this is a piece of golden wisdom. The technical term for this is a macarism, a statement of blessing in wisdom literature. There are 26 of these in the book of Psalms. Blessed is the man who makes the Lord his trust, who does not turn to the proud, to those who go astray after lies. So you'll be blessed if you trust in the Lord and not in man, not in the proud, not in those that think that they have the power to save, but ultimately put your trust in the Lord himself. I love verse 5. You've multiplied, O Lord my God, your wondrous deeds and your thoughts towards us. None can compare them to you. And he promises to tell them to everyone. These acts of God are beyond telling. They're so great. They're just wonderful. It reminds us of what David wrote later in Psalm 139, how precious toward me are your thoughts, O God. How vast is the sum of them. They outnumber the grains of sand. So just a delightful opening to this psalm where David is expressing his joy at God's rescue. And then he moves to a promise of obedience. He says, in sacrifice and offering you've not delighted, but you've given me an open ear. Burnt offering and sin offering you've not required. It's a good example of parallelism here. Sacrifice, offering, burnt offering, sin offering. These correspond to one another, as does God's relationship to those. He doesn't delight in those things. He doesn't require those things. What he really wants is our obedience. And that's probably what is at the heart of this kind of strange statement. You've given me an open ear. The Hebrew is literally ears you have dug for me. And I don't know who digs ears, but it's probably this idea that God has taken, as it were, an instrument and opened up David's ears. Now, there are two possible interpretations of this from what I can tell. One is it may be a reference to a ritual that was practiced in both the book of Exodus and Deuteronomy. We have a reference to this ritual where a servant would pledge themselves to lifelong obedience to their master. There are many people in the ancient world that were in servitude, often because of their debts, and so they would be obligated for a certain period of time to work for someone else in repayment of a debt. But a servant could freely say, I want to pledge my lifelong service to you, and I am forever yours, your servant, your slave. And they did this by piercing their ear, by driving an awl through their ear and into a door. And this symbolic action was a way of declaring their loyalty and obedience for a lifetime to their master. So perhaps David is saying, that's how I feel about you, Lord. I am committing my life in obedience to you like a servant would to his master. Or it could be that this is in a more general sense that David is saying, you have opened my ears to understanding and receiving your law. There's an openness that I have to obeying you and following you. That lends itself to, because of as the correct interpretation based on the following verses. He says, I have come in the scroll of the book, it is written of me, I delight to do your will. Your law is written in my heart. So it seems to express that openness to receiving the law of God and obedience to the law of God. Now, this text then is echoed in Jeremiah 31, where I've highlighted it there. I will put my law within them. I'll write it on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people. And it describes this age, this season of God's people willingly following Him. That it's not a matter of, hey, we're obligated to do this, but that we desire to obey God. There's been a transformation of our hearts, and so that we are tender and open and obedient to God. And that seems to be what's happening with David here. He's saying, I am willingly surrendering and following your law. Now you'll notice there is a Septuagint, that is the Greek translation of the Old Testament variant, and that's the one that's picked up in the New Testament. I want to mention this because the writer of Hebrews quotes this extensively, and he references Jesus here. He says that this text ultimately is pointing us to Jesus, whose body was prepared, highlighting the Septuagint's translation. That's what the author of Hebrews does here. A body you have prepared for me. And what he is saying is that Jesus is the fulfillment of this psalm, that Jesus offered not just his ear, not just a life of service, but his very life, his body, as a sacrifice for us. And that in doing so, it says that this completely fulfilled the law, that Jesus is the one who came to do God's will, and in doing so established a new covenant, and we are sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once for all. So Jesus then is seen as the ultimate fulfillment of this psalm, that David's words here are pointing to this final and complete sacrifice of Jesus' body offered for us. And in doing so, it gives us a new heart, the law of God now written on our hearts, not out of obligation, but out of gratitude. We serve God through Jesus, who offered himself for us. We respond to his act of grace with obedience. David continues with the promise of telling the good news of his deliverance to the congregation. So this is speaking here of corporate worship, that David's not going to hold back. He's going to testify. He's going to tell his story of God's faithful love and his faithfulness, his constancy to the congregation. And that continues there in verse 11. He says, even though I've got evils that are surrounding me beyond number, I've got iniquity, I've got moral failure and brokenness that has overtaken me, and I'm not fully aware of all this. I can't see everything. They've surrounded me, these enemies, my iniquities. They're more than the hairs of my head. My heart fails me. So David moves into a bit of lament here, a bit of sorrow here for what he has done and for the enemies that have surrounded him. He uses this metaphor of the hairs of his head to suggest the uncountable nature of this. Jesus will use that same metaphor in a completely different context in the New Testament, but this is where it first occurs in the Bible, of a vast number, the hairs of my head. So David again moves from this position of celebration and trust and confidence to, wait a minute, I've got some struggles here as well. And so he turns to conclude this song with prayers of request. So, Lord, deliver me, hurry up, help me, and those that are against me, let them be put to shame and disappointed, let them turn back, and let them be dishonored. who delight in my hurt. Let them be appalled because of their shame. So he's praying for a reversal here as he wraps up this psalm. And he returns to words of confidence in verse 16. May all who seek you rejoice and be glad. May those who love your salvation continually say, great is the Lord. So he's not just speaking of his own experience, but he's saying, hey, I'm not alone in this. And those of you who have experienced the Lord's salvation, let's worship him together. For as for me, I'm poor and needy, but the Lord takes thought for me. You're my helper, my deliverer. So hurry up, God, come and rescue me. It's a beautiful psalm that moves us from the past to the present to the future. And David celebrates God's deliverance of him in the past, lifting him out of the miry clay, setting his feet on a rock, and he promises to be faithful and obedient to God, and he looks forward to God's deliverance in the future and says to everyone along with him, sing the song with me, great is the Lord. And of course, this psalm being applied by the writer of Hebrews to Jesus reminds us that rescue has come to us. Rescue has come ultimately in Jesus, who gave himself for us. So we have rescue from sin, rescue from death, because Jesus was obedient, and because he tasted death, he suffered death for us. And as the writer of Hebrews says, then we have a new covenant, a new kind of relationship with God that's rooted in the sacrifice of Jesus, and we respond out of gratitude to that gift of grace. And we can sing with the psalmist, you lifted me up from the miry pits, and I will sing a new song to the Lord.